hours earlier, this stretch of forest had gone 3 months without real rain. The lagoon that fed it was shrinking by the day, and everything that depended on it. Fish, birds, capybara, caiman had been quietly pulled toward the same shoreline. Nothing had forced this.
The river simply pulled back, inch by inch, and left behind
a single sheet of brown water surrounded by cracked mud. In the Amazon, the dry season doesn't announce itself with drama. It works slowly, removing options one at a time, until only one place is left to drink, hunt, or hide.
This year, that place was a lagoon no wider than a football pitch,
fed by a creek that had stopped flowing 2 weeks earlier. 2 animals were converging on it from opposite directions. Neither knew the other existed yet. Both were running out of choices. The female jaguar had hunted this floodplain for 4 years. Her territory used to stretch along nearly 6 kilometers of riverbank, enough space to avoid every other jaguar in the region and still find a meal most nights.
The drought had folded that territory in half. Streams she once used as hunting corridors
were now dry trenches, and the deer and peccary that used to scatter through the underbrush had pulled back toward the last standing water, the same lagoon. A jaguar reads a landscape, the way most predators read a scent trail. Tracks pressed into drying mud told her how many capybara had passed in the last day, how recently, and in which direction. 3 sets of prints, all fresh. All heading the same way she was. She followed them without hurry. Patience costs nothing when the destination is fixed. 2 nights earlier, that patience had failed her. A peccary she'd stalked for nearly 20 minutes had caught her scent on a shift in the wind and bolted into a thicket too dense to follow. She hadn't eaten since. A missed hunt rarely changes a jaguar's strategy outright, but it sharpens it. She had moved more carefully since, staying downwind, choosing cover over speed, narrowing her search to wherever prey had the fewest places left to run. The shrinking lagoon offered exactly that. 2 kilometers downstream, a male green anaconda was making the same calculation, though his came from hunger rather than territory. Anacondas don't chase. They wait at the places prey is forced to visit, and right now, prey was being forced to one place only. He had spent the previous week in a side channel that had supported him for over a year, ambushing capybara and the occasional caiman from beneath a tangle of submerged roots. 3 days ago, the channel had dried to a trickle, then to nothing. He'd moved twice since, each time toward lower, wetter ground. Each time finding less of it. Heat does something specific to a snake's body that it doesn't do to a cat's. An anaconda can't regulate its own temperature, so as the sun climbed higher over the drying forest, he was forced. A body that can't cool itself was quietly steering nearly every decision he made that week. The last patch of deep water he'd tried to claim had already been taken. A larger female, drawed by the same shrinking options, had settled into the deepest pool along that stretch of bank. And rather than risk a confrontation, he had no real chance of winning. He had moved on before she'd even fully noticed him. Among green anacondas, size settles most disputes before they start. He didn't have the size to argue, so he kept moving toward the one body of water large enough that no single animal could hold all of it. By mid-morning, birds began giving away what neither predator could see directly. A pair of hoatzins burst from the canopy near the lagoon's eastern edge. Alarm calls rattling through the trees. Something large had moved through the brush there. The jaguar's ears rotated toward the sound, before her body did. The lagoon itself had started showing the same pressure in quieter ways. Dead fish lined parts of the shallows where oxygen had dropped too low to support them. And a loose column of black vultures had begun circling above the water each afternoon, riding the heat in slow, patient turns. Egrets and cormorants crowded the remaining shoreline in numbers the lagoon hadn't seen in years, picking through what the falling water exposed. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together, it read like a countdown. She didn't run. Running wastes energy that a jaguar can't always recover when meals are scarce. Instead, she eased into the speckled shade along the tree line, dropped low, and let the alarm calls finish before continuing forward. Within 100 meters, she found what had spooked the birds. A black caiman, nearly 2.5 meters long, hauled out on a mud bank to bask. The last deep pool of the lagoon directly behind it.
A caiman on land is vulnerable. In a way, it almost never is in water. Out of its element, it loses the speed advantage that keeps most predators away.
And a jaguar's bite is built for exactly this kind of opportunity, strong enough to drive through a reptile's skull rather than simply wound it. She would only get one approach. If the caiman reached the water first, the contest was over before it began. She would only get one approach. If the caiman reached the water first, the contest was over before it began. And 4 seconds is usually all a jaguar needs. She'd close the gap low and fast through cover. The caiman couldn't see past. And by the time it registered movement, the distance to the pool was already lost.
A bite to the base of the skull ended the contest before the caiman could roll into a defensive position. The same precision strike jaguars use on capybara, peccary, and on the rare anaconda, unlucky enough to be caught on land. She fed for over an hour, dragging portions back into the shade between bouts. In no rush now that the kill was secured. It was the largest meal she'd taken in 9 days.
And it bought her something more valuable than calories: time.
Time to wait near the lagoon without needing to hunt again immediately. Time that put her, without any plan beyond instinct, directly in the path the male anaconda was already taking.
By the time she finished, a pair of black vultures had already settled in the branches above what remained of the carcass.
Waiting their turn with the patience of birds that have learned, a jaguar's kill always leaves something behind.
Within the hour, smaller caiman would slip in to take what the vultures left.
In a system running this short on water, almost nothing went uneaten for long. While she fed, he had reached the lagoon's southern edge, sliding through reeds with barely a ripple to mark his passing.
A green anaconda moves through water the way it can't move on land.
Silent, controlled, almost invisible, except for 2 raised nostrils breaking the surface. What he found waiting for him was a capybara herd of 6 animals, pressed into the shallows because there was nowhere left to retreat to. Capybara are capable swimmers and usually post a sentry to watch for exactly this kind of threat. But after weeks of declining water and rising heat, this group had grown desperate enough to crowd closer to the reeds than they should have.
Desperation, as much as hunger, was about to decide what happened next.
The strike came from directly beneath the herd, where none of the sentries were looking. An anaconda doesn't kill with venom, it kills with mechanics. A strike fast enough to seize before the target can react, followed by coils that tighten with every exhale the prey takes until breathing becomes impossible. The capybara he'd targeted was dead within minutes, and the rest of the herd scattered toward the far bank, putting even more distance between themselves and the water's edge. He spent the next several hours doing what anacondas almost always do after a kill of that size: nothing.
Swallowing a capybara whole is a slow, deliberate process.
And digesting it afterward leaves a snake of his size sluggish and exposed for days. He moved only as far as he needed to, into a shallow backwater, half submerged beneath a fallen log, close enough to the lagoon to still feel its pull, far enough to feel hidden. Above him, a troop of howler monkeys had pushed lower into the canopy than usual, drawn down by fruiting trees near the shrinking water. Their calls carried for kilometers through the still, dry air, a sound that normally marked a healthy, undisturbed forest. Here, it marked the opposite: animals abandoning higher ground because there was less to find there than there used to be. It was a defensible position against almost everything in this ecosystem. Almost everything.
3 days passed, and the lagoon kept shrinking. What had been a connected wetland
was now a single body of water, no larger than a few hundred meters across,
with every animal in the region drawing toward it out of necessity rather than choice.
The Jaguar's territory had effectively collapsed into this one shoreline. The anaconda, still heavy from his meal and unable to retreat far from water without overheating, had nowhere left to go either. The remaining capybara herd had stopped scattering entirely and now moved as one tight group along a single stretch of bank, hosting 2 sentries instead of 1. Caiman that would normally avoid each other's territory were basking within meters of one another.
Too short on space to enforce the usual distance. Even the insects had changed their pattern.
Cicadas falling silent for hours at a stretch during the worst heat of the afternoon, then erupting all at once as the temperature dropped toward evening. Every species sharing this water had been pushed into closer contact than the forest usually allowed, and neither of the 2 largest predators in the basin was an exception. Neither predator was hunting the other. That had never been the plan. But the dry season doesn't care about plans. It simply keeps closing space until the last 2 animals standing in it have no buffer left between them. On the 4th evening, with the heat finally breaking and the first real clouds of the season building over the canopy, the Jaguar moved down to the lagoon's edge to drink. She'd fed well, rested well, and had no reason to expect danger here. This had been her water source for years, the way it does in the minutes before an Amazon storm. Wind that had been still all week picked up off the water, carrying her scent. The anaconda, still digesting and still slow, had chosen that same stretch of bank to warm himself one final time before. Both had earned the right to be here. Neither had any reason to expect the other. The outcome had been decided long before either predator saw the other. A green anaconda heavy with a recent meal loses the one advantage that usually keeps it safe from a jaguar. His strike came fast, coils already beginning to rise from the shallows. But a body still digesting a capybara cannot generate the explosive recoil of a snake at full readiness.
She was already past his first lunge and onto his neck before the coils found purchase.
Her bite driving for the same point at the base of the skull that had ended the caiman 3 days earlier.
It is the same target a jaguar uses on almost everything it kills, because it is the target that ends a fight before the fight can really start.
He never fully wrapped her. By the time his body convulsed into a final defensive coil, it had already lost the strength to matter. The outcome came down to timing more than size. A fully alert anaconda of his length can be more than a match for a jaguar in open water.
But trapped in the shallows where his strength and reach mattered most. On land, digesting.
And caught from an angle he couldn't track fast enough, none of that mattered. He had survived a drought, a larger rival, and 3 months of shrinking water, only to be undone by the one disadvantage every predator eventually faces: being found at the wrong moment, in the wrong condition, by something faster. She didn't feed immediately. She rarely does after a fight that costs her this much effort. Instead, she rested beside the lagoon. As the first real rain of the season began to fall, breaking the drought that had pushed both of them here in the first place. By morning, the rain had refilled channels that had been dry for weeks. Capybara that had clustered into one desperate, crowded herd were already beginning to disperse back across a floodplain that finally had room for them again.
Vultures and a young black caiman moved in to take what remained of the anaconda.
Nothing in this ecosystem goes to waste for long. The fish that had been dying in the shallows a week earlier
Would have clean, oxygenated water to return to within the month, and the herons and cormorants
that had crowded the lagoon's edge began spreading back out along the reopening creeks. The jaguar's territory, the one that had folded into a single shoreline 3 months earlier, began unfolding again with the rain. Within a week, she would resume using ground she hadn't crossed since the drought began, and the pressure
that had briefly forced every predator in the basin onto the same narrow strip of mud would ease. Nothing about this collision was random. The water didn't choose who survived.
It simply ran out, slowly enough for 2 of the river's most capable predators to be measured against the only thing in the Amazon that has never lost a contest: the season itself. By the time the rains return each year, the forest has already decided who gets to walk back into it. It was over almost as quickly as it began.